I'm with CFACT, the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, and I appreciate this opportunity to discuss with you a little bit about our recent election and what's taking place, because there's much we can teach each other between Europe and the United States in these sorts of developments. CFACT was founded in 1985 by two extremely excellent people who I hope that you sometime get the chance to meet, David Rothbard and Craig Rucker, and we focus on issues of energy, environment, development, and human rights. And what makes CFACT particularly special is its sincerity. You will never meet two better leaders of an NGO or political leaders than David Rothbard and Craig Rucker. Everything they do for the right reasons, and I hope that over time that you'll get a chance to meet them. An interesting thing about American politics and global warming and climate is that climate has never ranked high in the minds of Americans or in the minds of American voters. In fact, environmental issues in general don't tend to rank as high as pocketbook issues, don't tend to rank as high as the economy, the military issues, foreign policy. These are always more important to Americans. And if you look at this Gallup poll, you'll notice that between 2000 and 2012, all environmental issues declined in the level of importance that Americans assigned to them, and that both in 2000 and 2012, global warming's at the bottom. Now, America uses a very different system of government than just about any European is used to, because we do not have proportional representation in our Congress. As a result, the minor parties, and we have minor parties, we have libertarians, we have Greens, we have socialists, other small parties, really capture one or two seats in general, and they don't tend to have an important role that they play when it comes to governing, but in elections, they play an important role, one, in introducing their ideas into the agenda, and two, they often act as spoilers, because they can take just enough votes from the Republican or the Democratic candidate to make the other side win. And usually, the minor candidate throws the election to the candidate they're most opposed to by taking away the votes from the candidate that they're most in alignment with, which frustrates Republicans and Democrats alike, but it's something you need to keep in mind also about the American system. So Republicans, as I think you're aware, tend to be more conservative, and while it was not originally true, today, by and large, tend to be climate skeptics. Democrats tend to be left liberal, and when we say liberal in the United States, we mean what you say here when you say left. We don't mean classical liberal. And they tend to be accepting of the ideas that are being put forward on climate, but they also, as I showed you in the previous slide, don't rank it high. They believe it, but it's not their most important issue. But who's also important in the American system are these independents, these swing voters, these people who are not enrolled in any party, because they are about a third of the electorate and they sit in the middle, and when they swing, they really swing. They are not convinced in one side or the other on almost any issue. They're momentum driven. They move en masse very quickly, and they tend to be a stabilizing force in American politics, because whenever one party comes to power and thinks this is it, we won this election, we're going to be the story from now on, back they come and swing back another way at one or two elections later, so that we always find ourselves sort of trapped in the middle. And we'll talk about this further, but always keep in mind when you consider how things are going to take place in American politics or on climate, that these swing voters are not deeply committed, and that they can go radically in either direction, and their favorite place to go is with who they perceive as going to be a winner. So when they see one side or the other gaining ground, they want to be a part of that, and then they make it bigger than it would have been naturally. When the climate issue first broke into the United States politics, nobody thought about it very seriously. And at first, everybody accepted, by and large, what you would consider to be the Al Gore version of climate. That was sold, nobody really challenged it, and originally, many politicians found the easiest course to go with that interpretation. Republicans and Democrats together found it simpler to go that way. And so in the beginning, there was, I think, a situation that resembles what many European countries have of a one-sided climate debate with no serious challenge. As a result of that, climate became the perfect issue for any politician who had had damaged reputation. If you want to rehabilitate your reputation, climate was perfect because it didn't affect the issues you cared about, and it was your opportunity to get a favorable mention in the New York Times and the big press, because this was your chance to go to the other side, get on board with climate, and look very intelligent. The skeptics came along in the United States, people like yourselves, and despite and contrary to the constant story with very tiny little budgets, they moved the debate. They showed out flawed science. They questioned the usefulness of government policies. They warned of the big waste of taxpayer dollars. They showed that warmists, people who really accept this climate idea, were getting rich. And Al Gore's fortune is now estimated at $200 million that he made through this whole climate issue. The ClimateGate scandal came along, and people found that unacceptable. So public opinion balanced on climate. The Republicans became a skeptical party, which they were not originally. The Democrats stayed where they were and continued to be in favor of the global warming policy as it's explained to them. But remember those swing voters? Many, many, many of them gave up on the idea of global warming, decided it was not a good investment, and they came back. So the Republican Party became skeptics. So now we have this chart that we showed you before, and this is where we are today, except that those swing voters, they swung against climate. So you'll see that when polling's done, this is done by Yale University, that Democrats strongly are in favor when they're asked about a climate treaty. Republicans tend to be more than half opposed, and independents, again, these non-voters, these middle voters, they tend to be all over the place. But always keep in mind that it's not anybody's top issue. But when you ask them the question, do you favor a climate treaty, Democrats will say yes, more than half of Republicans will say no. This chart includes what they call Tea Party voters. If you follow that, this was a rise of conservatives that took place during President Obama's original first term, and they are strongly opposed to the climate, and that's where public opinion is. But when you ask them all, what's your top issue, even though the Democrats might say they're in favor of a treaty, Americans in any party don't put climate near the top. Well, along the way, Mitt Romney got the nomination. I happen to know Mitt Romney. I think that my presence here devalued somewhat when he lost the election. But nonetheless, what happened was President Obama was reelected, but during the course of this entire campaign, neither President Obama nor Governor Romney spoke about climate. It was invisible in the debates. It was not in their commercials. It was not in their speeches, because they know that there was no solid group of Americans that were very interested in this. There is that small group of climate activists. You have them here and you know them well, but nobody was particularly interested in reaching out to them, and President Obama knew that he could count on their support no matter what took place. So in order to influence those swing voters, they were silent on climate and didn't say a word. But the election took place, and that night, this is what President Obama suddenly had to say. He remembered the climate issue, and in his victory speech, minutes after being declared the victor, said, "We want our children to live in an America that isn't threatened by the destructive power of a warming planet. In American politics, climate is back." Now, with President Obama, he never has to face the voters again. Do you remember this? When he was speaking before a microphone, or they had one around and they didn't have it turned off when it was supposed to be, and he was speaking with the Russian president, and he told him, "This is my last election. After my election, I have more flexibility." However, what we suspect is that President Obama had very many similar conversations with people who were working on the climate issue, and the unfortunate part is he did not do it in front of an open microphone. So with President Obama, you must judge him not by what he says, by what he does. He is a brilliant, clever politician. He's a gifted speaker. He's a natural. I mean, I've watched many political people over the years, and I truly admire the way he presents himself and the way he handles himself, and he's unique. You don't often see somebody that good. In America, we may not have had somebody that good since Ronald Reagan, maybe Bill Clinton, somebody who just has a natural gift for conveying his message. This man has that gift, And he understands that you do not bring those swing voters into your camp by telling them what they do not want to hear. You keep that quiet, you whisper it perhaps to President Medvedev, but it's not for the voters to hear. So now Obama's delegation, like your delegations, are in Doha. CFACT has a delegation there right this minute, and they're talking about the UN climate treaty. This is an early test of where the United States is going to go on climate policy and where this president's going to go. And I think we should watch it, because in the past at these UN conferences, the Obama administration has been very, very cautious. They do things behind the scenes, they spend a lot of money, but they do not sign on the dotted line on the treaty, and there's a reason for that. Our system of government works very differently in this, in that we have this system of checks and balances. And the Senate, not the Congress, unfortunately, which has no vote on treaties, but the Senate has a tremendous amount of power over formal treaties. 2/3 of the Senate must agree, must concur, as written in our Constitution, in order for a treaty to pass. This is extremely difficult for President Obama in order for him to actually move a UN climate treaty, because the Republicans are a minority, but they have almost half of the Senate, and the vast majority of them are not going to sign onto a global warming treaty. And Senator James Inhofe, who's the leader of that faction of the Republicans, he called global warming the greatest hoax that was ever perpetrated on the American people. So subtract almost all of their votes from the idea of getting a 2/3 ratification of a treaty. But the Democrats in the Senate also know that nobody in America, no substantial block of voters, ranks global warming high. So the Democrats are afraid to sign on it also. Now this is Senator Manchin, who won a special election, and he represents coal country, where they mine coal in West Virginia. And he said, I'll take dead aim at the cap and trade bill because it's bad for West Virginia. Now, when I come before you and I say I'm going to take dead aim at something, I mean it metaphorically. I mean it as a speech device. But when this man says he's going to take dead aim at something, this is what he means.
I'm Joe Manchin. I approve this act because I'll always defend West Virginia.
As your senator, I'll protect our Second Amendment rights. That's why the NRA endorsed me. I'll take on Washington and this administration to get the federal government off of our backs and out of our pockets. I'll cut federal spending, and I'll repeal the bad parts of Obamacare. I sued EPA, and I'll take dead aim at the cap and trade bill, because it's bad for West Virginia.
He's a good shot. Bullseye. So that's a Democrat. Now, he's not representative of most Democrats, but when you talk about getting not half, not a majority, but a supermajority, a 2/3 vote of the United States Senate, you see how challenging that's going to be for President Obama, probably impossible. But there's two sides to this President Obama. There's the President Obama who, during the campaign, boasted about, we have increased U.S. oil and gas production. And what I was hoping Mitt Romney would say to him and never did was, what's this we stuff? Because President Obama has not permitted expanded exploration for for fossil fuels on American-owned public land. This expansion that we talk about of American fossil fuels took place on private land where the government couldn't stop it. But this is also a president who likes to blame Republicans for gridlock in the Congress. So when he can't implement the policies he wants, he talks about that. So a re-elected Obama, who doesn't need to go back to the voters again, might choose to go for a treaty fight, to sign a treaty, bring it back, and then lambaste the Republicans and those Democrats who don't go with it as selling off of our children's future and destroying the planet. Whether he's willing to go that far on an issue that's never been central to him before, I don't know. But on election night, suddenly he rediscovered it, and that's something we're all going to have to watch. What Obama does do, when he can't get the votes through the Congress, is he uses his substantial regulatory power. The United States has one of the strongest chief executives under our system of most countries, excluding your totalitarian and your kingdoms and things like that. But for a real democracy, we've given our president great power. And so our EPA, our Environmental Protection Agency, our Energy Department, our Mining Department, all these different departments that we have answer to the president. And he can sometimes, and it's not just Democrat presidents that do this, Republicans do the same thing when they've got the power, can try and go past the Congress to use their regulatory power to enact their agenda and not ask the legislature their opinion. And that's what we've been seeing take place. And people have called it Obama's war on energy. The Clean Air Act was originally designed, as you heard some of our previous speakers talking about, to fight against particulates, the dirty things that come out of coal-fired smokestacks in the back of your emissions on your automobile, so that we didn't have to breathe in these particulates. But when the EPA redefined carbon dioxide, which some of you might have breathed out tonight, which I hope you'll keep that in mind, as a pollutant, it was a tremendous increase of the power of that agency and of the executive branch to control something they were never able to control before. It was never considered a pollutant before. There's still legal questions as to whether or not that interpretation was correct, but they're using that also to regulate mercury, despite the fact that almost all mercury in the air in the United States comes from natural sources, and only in the part that's put out by man-made sources is very small by comparison. This Keystone pipeline that can bring us tremendous amounts of energy from Canada is something that they're trying to block now. They have not let us explore on public lands. Offshore wells, they do everything they can to block that and not allow it. And even hydropower, especially in states like California and Washington, we have this wonderful free hydropower that's been going since the Great Depression. They built these dams. Under anybody's definition of energy production, they're extremely clean, they're extremely low cost. Yet because of their effect on fish and wildlife, they're now not permitting new dams, and they're looking to destroy existing dams. So even that is at risk. And this natural gas revolution that we've talked about, there's a tremendous information, disinformation campaign going on in the United States about fracking, where they talk about earthquakes, even though no significant, as we heard before, in England they didn't break any teacups. We don't drink that much tea in the United States, but our crockery hasn't broken as a result of fracking either. I see on the internet constantly people I know well, good friends, sharing information, explaining why fracking is terrible, why it's going to poison the drinking water, all these terrible things. None of this is true, but this is being sold in order to deny us this source of power as well. So remember these swing voters. When what's being talked about now in the United States is perhaps the Democrats and President Obama have achieved a permanent majority, because they're bringing in, which is a smart thing for them to do, groups of voters that didn't vote heavily in the past. Black voters, Hispanic voters, and they turned out heavily for President Obama. But the historical experience in the United States is that these swing voters come back and restore the center. 4 years ago, President Obama was elected, and they talked about a new permanent majority. 2 years later, the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, and if more seats had been up for election that year, would have taken control of the Senate. When that next corrective pendulum swing will take place remains to be seen, but we should expect that we'll see it. So the danger, however, is that climate is becoming institutionalized in the United States as it is institutionalized in Germany and in Europe. It's being taught in our schools. It's in not our radical, but in our center magazines. It's on television, not on special channels or something like that, but on the daily news broadcast. It's being taught, it's being broadcast as fact. And that's difficult for us to compete with, that kind of thing, because, when you listen to the experts who have spoken to you today and yesterday, they make a fascinating case. Maybe they're right and maybe they're wrong, but we'll never know if they can't enter the debate fairly and be spoken with. The British author C.S. Lewis had a term for that kind of power. I don't know how to translate it, if there's a good way to translate it as good as it is in English, but it's that hideous strength, that use of educational institutions, media institutions, government institutions to prevent the other side from speaking, to take the power, and to end the democratic process. And that's what I don't think we can allow. So here we have this whole idea of how do we fight this kind of propaganda. Is this me? Is this you, this horrible person in black going after this nice young lady here, paid for by a fossil fuel company? I wish actually we were funded by fossil fuel, which we're not, because what they do is they create an honest product, which they sell honestly, which gives people great benefit and allowed most of us to get here tonight. But they are afraid now to be involved in financing climate skepticism. So it's really just not true, no matter how many times it's said. So the only thing we can do is what you're trying to do, and what we're doing in the United States is to fight them with facts. So if even the National Weather Service in the United States, if their data shows that there's only 0.74s of a degree of warming in this whole thing, that's 0.74 degrees Celsius, suddenly now the scientists have just rediscovered Fahrenheit, even though Fahrenheit has not been the measure of temperature for science for a very long time. But Fahrenheit is back because it makes it more than a degree if you put that number in Fahrenheit instead of Celsius. So they'll call us anti-scientific, and yet they'll find whichever unit of measure suits their case. Similarly now, the Met Office, which is who advises the IPCC and the UN about what the temperature, their data is showing no significant warming for 15 to 16 years. It's the job of people like you, it's the job of the professors who have presented here today to come and show these facts so that we can beat this propaganda story. So I think America can learn a lot from Europe. On most of these issues, you've gone first. You were building wind turbines when we were just thinking about wind turbines, and you have them now. Now we're putting them up, and you want to stop building more and get rid of yours, and yet, can we learn from that example? So I'd say that we need to learn from what Europe has experienced, that we have a lot of work to do, and that the only way to really do this is that we have no fear, that we stand together, and that we work together, and that's the way to move this debate.